Yeah, it should automatically put it out there. Hey, we're streaming.
Yeah, I see it's tweeted. I'll retweet it. You can all retweet it. It's the JS Jabber
Yep.
account.
Yeah, I see us.
Yes.
Except AJ. I just see his shelf.
He was hiding on purpose.
I think it might be a second behind or something too.
I'm still experiencing death by cold.
Yeah. All right. Well, I retweeted it.
Same here.
Looks like we've got people filing in, 15, 16 people. Yeah, I'm trying to find notes on this. What exactly are we covering?
We're talking about effect. And not to be confused with use effect.
But there's a good pun intended there.
Yeah, I don't know if it's such a good pun, but it's a pun nonetheless.
Do you want to drop some links in the chat?
Yeah, probably the effect website. Also, maybe your talk about how effect came to be, which was really good. I really enjoyed that talk.
The keynote at Effect Days was a
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, I've got
fun
that
way to
YouTube
close.
video up right here. The origin story.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that was a pretty effective speech.
I see we are starting on a good track.
Oh, yes. Here, I'll even throw something in here for you that we'll use a lot later.
All right. Is it this one?
No.
I just
No.
put a YouTube link into the
Yeah.
chat too.
I don't have time to watch YouTube right now.
No, I'm just
doing a podcast.
We want to share it. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, the website of Effect is effect.website. So.
Okay.
I'll guess we'll discuss it when we actually start the actual recording, but I was amazed by, the scope of effect. I didn't realize it has become that sophisticated, but it's definitely something to discuss.
All right. Well, are we ready?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from Death by Common Cold.
Oh, my.
We also have Dan Shapir. It's been like 90 degrees here, AJ.
I had 2 sets of family come into town. I caught something somehow. It put me on bed rest for 3 days.
Well, it's definitely over. It's definitely over 90 degrees here in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and it's also kind of humid. So yeah, it's me from here.
Awesome. We also have Steve Edwards.
Yo, coming at you from, as always, cloudy Portland. Look, I'm wishing for some heat. Dan, send some heat my way, please.
We sent a basketball player your way.
Oh, in the draft?
Well, not exactly. He was traded to Portland right before the draft. He was playing in Washington before. And Denny Avdia is an Israeli basketball player.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I mean, boy, the international players are ruling the draft anymore.
Yeah, France dominated
this
year's draft.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I watch sports ball. The Euros are still going on. Anyway, I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And yeah, I've had family come into town. It's been 90 degrees here. I'm not sick. I just have seasonal allergies. Different story. Anyway, we have a special guest, and that is Michael Arnaldi. And yeah, do you want to introduce yourself? Let us know what effect you're having on the JavaScript community. That was worthy of Steve.
Yes, we are starting on dad jokes, and they are very funny topic.
Hold on. There we go. Sorry, I was doing something else.
That's too late. I'm from Italy. I'm currently sitting in Siena. I have no idea how much it is in Fahrenheit, but it's definitely hot. And
what is it?
Feeling well, so
Celsius.
Celsius, yes. We are European. We work on normal measurements. No,
I have to say that we also use Celsius in Israel, but generally speaking, the metric system makes more sense in my opinion. But actually, in the case of temperature, I think Fahrenheit might be a more human scale.
Yeah, Primogen was mentioning this because you can say something like, "Oh, it's in the 70s today," and that kind of gives you a broad range, like high 70s, low 70s. Whereas Celsius, it's like it's 23 or it's 24 or it's 25 or whatever it is, but like the range is the number.
Yeah, it's kind of like the grades you get in school, where you're graded from zero. Maybe you're graded from 0 to 100, but literally everything below 50 is basically essentially fail in the same. So you're really graded from something like 60 to 90.
Yeah. Well, and when I lived in Italy, I mean, there's a huge difference between 30 and 40. There's much less difference between 70 and 80.
Yeah, for sure.
In Fahrenheit. So
it's sort of like the Richter scale where you go up, it's a magnitude of 10 every time a number goes up.
No, we should do that.
It works.
Yeah. No, Celsius is linear. It's just that it goes from water freezing to water boiling.
Right.
And so anything above 60 is you're dead.
Yeah. And in very hot summer, it goes to like 45 sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
You are basically a non-human at that point.
When I lived in Ancona for basically the entire month of August, it was 103. It was like 103 here. It was 42, and it was 100% humidity. And so, I was a missionary for the church, and so I could only take off so many of my clothing articles before, right? I could not take off enough to get comfortable. Let's just put it that way. So,
yeah, my daughter's been in Thailand for the last year as a teacher, and before she came home, I'd look at the weather, and it was like about 100 with 90% humidity or something like that. She sort of got used to it. So it's, she comes back here and like, oh man, this is nothing. I want my heat back. I'm like, well, I don't know about that much, but I'd look at the temperature. So it's only 75 in Chiang Mai. And then my wife would say, but that's at night, right? I was like, oh yeah, that's at night.
Yeah. Well, before we get into TypeScript and whatnot, I'll just mention that my daughter is currently in Sri Lanka. So yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
So none of us in cold places currently.
Nope. Go do it in a shirt and tie. That's fun. Anyway, so we're talking about effect, and just for our listeners, if you're wondering, because if you Google it, effect is kind of a common word. It's effect.website is the web page you're looking for, so you can get into, okay, what is this and what does it do? But we're on a podcast, and we're going to assume that you haven't done that. So, Michael, what is it and what does it do?
Oh, that's a broad question. I would have to say that in general, it's a kind of a TypeScript framework to write production grade code. It really came to exist out of needs on a company I was working with when we migrated a lot of system from the JVM to JavaScript in the backend, because we were crazy people around about 5 or 6 years ago. Why would you ever use TypeScript on a serious backend project? Well, it ended up costing way less than the JVM, and productivity was skyrocketing. The only issue is there was nothing to write really production grade code.
I have to interrupt you here because
Yes.
At the previous company that I worked at, which is Next Insurance, I left them about a month and a half ago. The front end was obviously web, so it's JavaScript, it's React, or it's Angular or React Native if it's a mobile device. But the backend was all JVM. It was implemented in Kotlin, and it was all JVM. And when I jokingly mentioned the possibility of implementing that stuff, that business logic, in JavaScript, I was met with hysterical laughter.
Well, you see, I was CTO, so the hysterical laughter was less less present in that case. But yes, it is a hysterical laugh, and, but that's the point. It's a very nice language, but it's really hard to use it when you care about the software you write. And I mean, writing testable software, writing software that can be monitored well, stuff like observability and so on and so forth. It's a recent trend. But even 6 years ago, when I started developing Effect as an internal project, my main goal was clean up the mess that we were building. And we had been developing banking applications, and everything needed to be monitored properly. We had at the time what was called open tracing, which later got sort of merged into open telemetry as a larger effort. And we had Prometheus for metrics. We had well, we had to do that stuff. So our code was basically a hell of try catches. Try, open span, catch, close span. If there is an error, finally.
You're talking about the TypeScript code, right? You're not still
Yes, I'm talking about the
yeah.
TypeScript code.
Can I
that was
ask you about that
post-migration.
before we dive into TypeScript and obviously Effect, which is like the gist of this conversation? I do want to talk a little bit more, if I may, about that decision to move off of the JVM and move over to TypeScript. Now, I watched the talk that you recently gave, an excellent talk at the Effect conference. I think it was the closing keynote, something like that, about how Effect came to be. Highly, obviously we'll discuss it here as well, but it's still a highly recommended talk in my opinion. But I do have to ask like a general question about JVM versus Node, because if you're talking about backend in JavaScript or TypeScript, you're basically talking about Node, maybe Ban, maybe Dino, but essentially it's more or less more the same. One of the reasons that I mentioned like about the hysterical laugh is not necessarily about the programming language itself. I guess that comes to play into it as well, but it's also about like whether or not, JVM being an enterprise grade platform and doubting JavaScript or the JavaScript engines as enterprise grade platforms. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I would challenge the fact that the JVM is generally enterprise ready. And the second element is I would challenge what enterprise ready means, actually. Uh, I know a lot of backend developers who 6-7 years ago they would never think of writing a backend in TypeScript with Node.js. At that point in time, there was no other choice. There was only Node.js. Only more recently came to exist other runtimes such as Ban, Dino, and so on and so forth. So at that point in time, it was really targeting purely Node.js. And the usual complaints are like, that's not multi-threaded. But on the other side, do you actually need multi-threading? Probably not. And there has been a more recent wave of, I don't know how to explain it, but people that 7 years ago told me I was crazy now tell me I'm right. In
Do you
the
know how many
majority of the
hamburgers I
cases.
could make out of the sacred cows you guys have been slaughtering?
To be fair with regard to multi-threading, I totally agree with you. I think especially in this day and age of containers and the fact that in many cases you're intentionally limiting the number of cores per container, then especially then the whole point of multi-threading kind of goes out the window in a lot of ways. So the event loop mechanism that JavaScript uses is very, very effective for this type of thing. And people forget that Node was created with JavaScript initially because Ryan Dahl was looking for something like an event loop and this whole mechanism, and especially now with the sync await, it becomes much easier. But my point is actually something else. It's more about the robustness of the platform itself. Like, you know, how the garbage collector, for example, or the networking stack. I mean, how far do you trust them compared to quote unquote enterprise grade solutions? Whether they be the JVM or Go or something like that.
Well, I mean, if you speak about garbage collection, you should also pick a specific algorithm to target against in the JVM. There's many different garbage collectors in the JVM, and there's many different implementations of the JVM itself. There's more enterprisey implementations, there's more open source implementations. The two things change quite drastically, at least in my experience when working with the JVM. I think overall, Node.js in specific can be trusted a lot. I'm not too familiar with the other newer runtimes. I've tried them, but I have never deployed services that were serving millions and millions of customers based on Ban or Dino. So I wouldn't be able to say with the same level of confidence that they can be trusted. I'm sure they can, given that they are based on very similar JavaScript runtimes. But the advantage of JavaScript, and it might sound ridiculous, but it is a highly specified language that almost from day one had very different browsers implementing it, and it has survived in browsers for a long time. And UI development is I've disregarded UI development for years, but I came to realize that it is actually very complex and very performance intensive, because in a JavaScript event loop in the browser, you've got only one thread. So if you block that thread, the interface is stuck. But there are interfaces that have to do a lot of things. I was developing trading dashboards in JavaScript. There's a lot going on in the UI of a trading dashboard that requires careful management of memory and so on and so forth. And JavaScript was always very fine. And when developing backends, to be honest, I never had an issue with the garbage collector. You may have some pauses, that's totally normal, but also it's always a trade-off on how much memory you allocate to the JS process and so on and so forth. If you don't allocate much memory, there's not going to be a lot of stop the word. So it goes back to your argument of parallelism. If you parallelize at the scheduler level with multiple containers and so on and so forth, there's not really any huge problem with JavaScript per se, at least from what I've seen. I've been mostly developing IO intensive applications, so I wouldn't make the same argument when we talk about CPU intensiveness and other you know other places in the scale between memory allocations and so on and so forth. But for IO bound applications, which to me are like 90+% of what we are all developing, take the data from one database, push it in another API, call Kafka to stream out the events, and whatnot. It's basically taking data from place A to place B. JavaScript is always very effective in doing that type of job.
One thing that I want to point out though is JavaScript is multi-threaded, or at least the implementations that we have are multi-threaded. So it's not like the old Python or the old Ruby. I believe that there may be some implementations of Python and Ruby that do take advantage of multi-threadedness, like what Ryan Dahl was working on in Ruby before he was working in Node. There was I forget what it was called. I think it was called Event Machine. Anyway, but it actually is multi-threaded, and there is a performance difference whether you run on a single core or you run on 2 cores. You will get better performance running on 2 cores, because when you're running on a single core, that means that the background tasks can't actually run in the background. That everything has to be on one single core, and there's no ability to use the optimizations that it has. And this is something that Go suffers from this as well. In fact, the most famous clip that we got from this show was me saying something not quite right in the right context about this exact scenario. So I'll try to
and the Primogen picking then basically picking up on that. I would slightly modify the statement as saying that JavaScript itself is single-threaded. The JavaScript engine that runs JavaScript is not a single-threaded and is able to leverage multiple cores for greater efficiency. For example, we talked about garbage collection. It actually, for example, V8 actually offloads some of the garbage collection activity off of the main thread if it to a separate thread. And if you've got multiple cores, then obviously the benefit is greater. I before we move on back to effect, which is why we're all here, I would like to say that I totally agree with what you said, Michael, and I would also slightly add that also everything that's been happening with in cloud environments like AWS, Lambdas, and edge computing has also greatly contributed to JavaScript as a middleware / server side programming language and platform.
I mean, JavaScript has been almost from day one front end center in what we call BFFs, backends for front ends. So basically, the first backend aggregating multiple different APIs. That thing was always JavaScript was always very natural for that thing. To the point where now with full stack frameworks, we sort of get that embedded in the normal architecture. Because if you develop an app with, I don't know, Next.js, Remix, or so on and so forth, I'm not a front-end developer, so apologies if I haven't named other very well-designed frameworks. I just lack knowledge in that specific area, but I have investigated a lot, both Next.js and Remix, and the fact that you have these sort of server actions or server functions, however you want to call them, it is the classical middleware in between your databases, your other APIs, and so on and so forth, that plug that together exactly for the purpose of serving a front end. This is an IO bound job to do, and JavaScript has always been perfect for that. I think now JavaScript is also getting adopted in the layers more closer and closer to the actual backend. So it's moving progressively, taking slices and slices of the stack. I would also slightly correct what was said before about multi-threading in JavaScript. Just for the point of obsessive correctness, it is multi-threaded as an interpretation of the language, but the language itself is not multi-threaded. So there's no observability of different threads in JavaScript. It's the engine that may or may not decide to allocate stuff on thread pools. Usually, for example, file system operations and so on and so forth, they were backed by thread pools up until recently, where the kernels support asynchronous processing of files So the access to the file system is now no longer using thread pools; it's just using straight up a non-blocking interface. And Dan is completely right. V8, but also I think also Spider Monkey, but I might be wrong in the internal details. Sometimes garbage collection is notoriously one thing that that is offloaded a lot to other threads. So by no means it's backed by a single thread, but you can only observe a single thread from the language, which makes
Also,
total sense.
yeah, also parsing the actual JavaScript into bytecode can happen off the main thread as well. But getting back to effect, per my understanding of what you were starting to say, because before I so rudely diverted you to other topics, you were kind of in the process. You decided to move your company off of the JVM and onto node-based backend, and that resulted in you writing a lot of code, and that kind of evolved into effect eventually. So how did that
With
magic happen?
intermediate step of pain, because first of all, another big part of the reasons why we moved to Node.js was not only the architecture of Node that actually made sense for the services that we were running, but also it made sense as an organization decision in the company because most of our developers were front-end developers trained in TypeScript. We didn't have a lot of JVM developers. We had been using both Scala and Kotlin. Kotlin's a bit easier to get for example, for Java people. Scala might be a bit more tedious, but still, for a small team, having to hire into two completely different landscapes is hard. Not only for the language, but also for the runtime. Writing code in a way that is optimizable in the JVM. It's a hard topic. It's a very valuable topic that many do very well. But if you have 5 developers in total, it's going to be very hard that you have all the skills across the board required to write very productive software from backend to front end and so on and so forth. So the decision was taken on two different main reasons. The one reason was the JVM was a bit heavy for us, and the second reason was we really had TypeScript developers, and I wanted to use those developers across the stack and not have them in silos. So both of those reasons were present in the decision of moving over. We moved over progressively, and we started to write plain and normal TypeScript. But as I was describing, we were reaching a point where the code was no longer maintainable, and we didn't have any tools such as, for example, in Java you have runtime reflection. In in Rust and similar languages you have macros. You can, for example, say I want all my functions to be annotated with spans. There's nothing similar that you can do in JavaScript or TypeScript. I use the two interchangeably at this point in time. Uh, Doing all that work manually meant that our code was really not maintainable, and let alone testability. Testability was a horror story. Um, so that motivated what then became Effect. And it really started with me having a look at different languages and solutions available in different languages. That's when I found out about Scala and Zio and started taking some of the ideas into TypeScript land.
So looking again, I watched your talk, which, like I said, is excellent, and you kind of emphasized several times there that testing and testability was a significant motivator for the things that you did. Weren't things like, I don't know, vtest or even the new node testing library, well, that maybe didn't exist at the time, but you certainly had things like Mocha or Jasmine or Jest or stuff like that. Weren't they enough in terms of testability?
Well, the issue is when you want to test using monkey patching, you're already in a place that that is exposed to a lot of trouble. Namely, you have to hook up into the loading time of modules, and you might have side effects all over the place. So there's actually no guarantee that you mock up the module at the right point in time for your application to load the mock module, and so on and so forth. And point two, there's no explicitness in the dependency graph. You have no idea if a piece of code depends on the database, depends on something else. You actually have to read the code to understand that thing. So to write the test, you have to read the implementation. You have to know the implementation very well, and you have to patch yourself at the right point in time to be able to test. It is possible. I haven't said that it's impossible. I said that it was a lot of pain in making sure that all of those problems that I've described don't end up happening. We were doing testing. We were not doing as much testing as we were doing later, but we were testing a little bit using, I think at that point in time, exactly Mocha and Chai, if I recall correctly, that we still ended up using later. It's just the monkey patching element that isn't great. And if you have explicit dependencies and explicit dependency injection, you can say in a very simple way, well, I have this piece of code, just provide to it a test dependency instead of a real dependency. Later on, I even got to the point of doing more of end-to-end testing through the same tooling. I was creating database through test containers, taking the configuration from the created container, embedding the configuration into my application, and everything was running just fine. So the ability of doing higher order dependency injection and so on and so forth are really key to have an architecture that can be well tested. And it really means an architecture that is modular enough. You could do everything without effect in a very diligent and precise way, but it's very hard, and you naturally screw up over time. Effect sort of forces you into that golden path of writing software that can be tested, even if you then decide not to test it. The properties of good testable software are properties of good software, good maintainable and good software in general. So the point per se is not really about testing it. It's rather about having it testable, which is more of an architectural point of view instead of the practice of writing the tests per se.
So I'll go for it, Chuck.
I was just going to say, it feels like we're kind of talking about these theoretical properties of effect, right? It's testable. It's easy to follow along with. It works in these specific ways. Can you give us like a concrete example of how effect actually leads us to write testable or maintainable software?
Well, it does explicit dependency injection. So you see when you have a function or when you have an effect, which we should say it's akin to a smarter promise to some extent, a promise that when you create it doesn't just start right away, but you have to invoke it to make it execute the code. And that smart promise also tracks other two things: the errors that the program may arise and the dependencies that the program consumes. So if I have a piece of code that uses a database, I see that the piece of code uses a database. But it gets more specific. If I have a piece of code that uses the user repository or the to-do repository or any other service that you might want, I see that explicitly in the code itself, in the type of that effect. And I cannot run that effect unless I provide all the requirements. And that means when you get to test a piece of code, you have your piece of code. To invoke it, you have to provide everything. If you don't provide everything, it complains that it doesn't compile. It's not complaining in the sense that it fails at runtime. it doesn't even compile. So the LSP gives you instantaneous feedback in saying, hey, this piece of code needs a user repository, but for this test, you're not giving me a user repository. What should I do? So you have to specify user repository, which is the case where you are in testing, forcing you to do this. It really has complete control over the execution environment of that specific piece of code. But beyond that, you can do observability, you can do error handling, and so on and so forth. You might say, I want this piece of code with a span that is called foo, and that span will be automatically added. If you have OpenTelemetry configured, it's going to be exported to OpenTelemetry, and you can see your code from OpenTelemetry dashboards, such as there's many open source, there's many products. I don't want to give user hints on what to pick, but I've loved many of different OpenTelemetry based dashboards. I personally like to use sometimes Honeycomb, sometimes Datadog, and so on and so forth. But the point is, this is not only testable, it's also observable, and so on and so forth. It's kind of taking all the necessary requirements of writing a production grade piece of software and putting you on track of saying, okay, you can do all of this. This is pre-packed. And in my experience, if users, or rather, if developers can do something good and it's easy, they do it. If it's hard, they really need a huge justification to end up doing it. Like, I don't know any developer who does OpenTelemetry in development, pre-production stage, that does not use Effect. Most of the people who use Effect end up doing OpenTelemetry from day one, because it's easy.
The company that I'm actually working at right now, called Sisense, we're in the process of integrating OpenTelemetry both into our Java JVM based stuff and into our node based stuff. And currently we're not using Effect, but I think it's currently mostly like an external type of integration, meaning that it's mostly looking at the environment itself rather than at business logic parts within the code. So, you're monitoring things like CPU usage and memory consumption and stuff like that, and not necessarily execution of let's say, particular business processes.
Well, monitoring stuff like CPU usage and memory consumption has nothing to do with telemetry. That's metrics. Telemetry is metering how long a specific invocation takes. You might do it at the environment level, which means, for example, tracing the lambdas, but you're not instrumenting your code, which means if you have a bottleneck, you have no idea where the bottleneck is still.
I totally agree with that. And by the way, I did instrument stuff using in the past, using just the Prometheus client for Node, that with its direct APIs. But I think the key thing that you said, and I hopefully our listeners noticed it, is that it's not being enforced by runtime errors. It's being enforced by the actual type system. And I think that's a key point, that it's not that if you don't properly invoke your code, then you'll get a runtime exception. It's that if you don't properly invoke your code, the code will not compile. You'll not be able to deploy it to begin with.
And I think this is an extremely important point, because there's two school of thoughts when talking about compilers and in general, in no specific terms, type checkers. You could use the type checker as a way to check that everything is right, or as a friend that tells you what's going on. Those different school of thoughts end up in different extremes. The second school of thought, which is more my school of thought, which is like use the compiler as a friend, ends up developing stuff like dependent type checkers and so on and so forth, which our audience can check out if they are curious. But in reality, what it means is not even compiling prevents you from running the code, but when you edit in VS Code or in the editor that you prefer, you're going to see real-time feedback of what you do. The same way that you can, if you type a function to take an argument of a number, you can't pass it a string. And it's very helpful not to pass it a string, because you know it straight away from VS Code directly. Oh, I'm calling it with the wrong parameter. I'm supposed to use this other thing. Well, imagine that for errors and dependencies, and it really brings type level safety to the control flow of managing dependencies and errors, which are notoriously very hard things to do. And if we, for example, isolate on errors, there are other languages that have typed errors. Java, for example, they have typed exceptions. They haven't been really nice, though. A lot of people complain about typed exceptions. I would say rightfully so. Why? Because when you think about errors, you're actually thinking about two different things. Stuff that can happen, but really shouldn't. Like, I'm running out of disk. There's nothing to do if I'm running out of disk. The program should crash. There's no way to recover from that. This is more akin to an exception. Or yeah, stuff like I'm making an HTTP call and the service is down. Is that surprising? No, that's a normal. It is completely expected that services from time to time may be offline for 1 or 2 seconds. But just retry. Or you have these two different types of errors that can occur. Errors that you should deal with those, and errors that you really don't care about and that should explode. If you have a single error model and you're pushing the two at the same level, which is what JavaScript exceptions and Java checked exceptions and so on and so forth do, you're going to have a nightmare, because then you're going to have your handling logic has to differentiate between the two. With effect, we have those as independent things. If your program explodes, you have a defect. If your program raises an error, you can handle the error in a typed manner.
Yeah,
So
I think it's a really important distinction that you're making. And again, just maybe to clarify to our users or listeners, users, it's kind of
users.
it's kind of the difference.
Welcome to the show, users.
Yeah, it's kind of the exactly. It's kind of the difference, like you said, between running out of disk space or network problem, which are things that, like you said, can happen and can reasonably happen within the lifetime of an application, versus undefined is not a function, which is something that should not happen. And basically TypeScript was kind of created in order to prevent from happening at runtime. And I guess that effect basically takes it to the next level, which is something that you expect from certain programming languages, like I don't know, like Elm maybe, or like a Haskell, or not necessarily from a language like TypeScript. So the fact that you were able to achieve that sort of safety on top of TypeScript is quite an achievement.
Honestly, was surprising to me. Again, I started by developing in Scala by myself, so I was considering TypeScript as a lesser of a type system. But to be honest, since I've started developing of Effect, I've realized that TypeScript is an extremely powerful language, and it's extremely well designed. And the hops that they have to go through to type the dynamic part of JavaScript made it such that the type system has some incredible features. Like, we even got to the point where the amount of things we could do in TypeScript was greater than the amount of things that were possible in Scala. For example, in Scala, you didn't have union types up until version 3, which did not exist at that point in time. And that means the error channel had to be an enum with a single name, but you can't say, for example, I have an enum which is composed of 3 potential branches, error A, error B, or error C. If I'm handling error C, that should be removed from the type. And that wasn't possible in Scala. In TypeScript, we were able to do that from day one. So actually, I realized that no, it is a very powerful type system, and I was completely wrong in thinking that it was in any way less powerful than other type systems. If anything, I still have to find another type system that gives me the same level of confidence, even if we go to languages such as Haskell or and so on and so forth. Those things have to be implemented on top of the type system. And open unions and open intersection and partial erasure of members of open unions and open intersections are not present in those type systems. So even though the languages are more restrictive, they are not powerful enough to represent those concepts the way that they are represented in effect in TypeScript. I know this is more theoretical and tangential.
Yeah,
but...
and I'll take us to a practical place in a second. I just want to mention again that I totally agree with you. And in fact, I recently tweeted that it's pretty amazing how TypeScript has been able to effectively implement a static type system on top of the poster child for dynamic typing and dynamic types. It's like herding cats, and they've literally been successful at it. So it's pretty amazing. But taking us to indeed a more practical level, you kind of described effects as a framework. Now, most JavaScript or TypeScript developers, and again, like you, I won't make the difference. I'll use the terms interchangeably. Most such developers these days are using some framework. They might be using, like you mentioned, Remix and Next.js, or they might be using something lower level like a Nest.js, or they might be using a client-side framework like Angular. Where does effect fit into this ecosystem? Is it like an alternative to one of these? Is it something that you would use in conjunction with one of these? How does it play into the JavaScript framework ecosystem?
It sort of depends. I've used the term framework. I should have probably used the term composable framework, because it's rather a huge toolbox where you can pick and choose what you use. You don't have to use it all. I don't know of any application that needs the entirety of effect. I know a lot of people that use it in conjunction with those full stack frameworks that you referenced. Um, I know some other people, especially in the backend, who ended up with almost an effect only solution. That means effect to the very main, your main function is an effect. To reach that point, at the moment, I believe it's only possible in a backend scenario. I would never attempt to do it on a front end. Albeit there are people developing rendering stacks on top of effect. There's a guy called Tyler Steinberger that's developing a project called Type, which uses tag template lead roles, and it's basically a full rendering stack based on effect, which is type safe, with does context propagation in a type safe way. It's a really interesting project, but it's very alpha and very experimental. I would not use anything like that for any production use case at the moment, at least. So I would say it depends what you do. if you are in the backend, it is very possible that you might be able to just use effect, because we have HTTP servers, we have
So it's a replacement for Express to an extent?
we have HTTP servers, so you could use it as a replacement to Express, but a replacement that does even more. For example, if you're developing an HTTP API, you might wanna generate an open API specification. We do that by default. So if you write a web server in using Effect HTTP, you're gonna get for free a test client. You're gonna get for free arbitraries for your testing. You're gonna get for free an open API specification from which you can generate clients in every language. You get a real type-safe client that you can use to call your server from TypeScript. So you get more, and the performance of it, it was an interesting journey, because everybody expected the native HTTP server of Effect to be slower than the alternatives. We are actually beating Express by a lot, and we are closer to Fastify, a little bit slower than Fastify, but not too far off, with the feature set of an Effect native solution. So again, everything is OpenTelemetry compliant. You have typed errors across the board, even across the network, because we can serialize both responses and errors. They're just objects, so that you can serialize them in the same way. We have our own internal replacement of Zod, which is called Effect Schema, which is bidirectional, can do both encoding and decoding. It is really a solution that, as you said at the very beginning, it's very broad in scope, and I would almost think of it as an NPM 2.0. You don't have to know everything to use it. You can just start with a few modules, but then you have HTTP servers and so on and so forth. The next level thing that we are developing now is clustering. You're gonna be able what you're able to do with, for example, Akka or Pecco in the JVM, or Erlang, Elixir, and so on and so forth. Clusterize a number of instances in JavaScript and do message passing style between them, which is pretty amazing that you can even get to that point in JavaScript. And that's already in alpha. In effect, it's called Effect Cluster. So it is very broad. It can replace some of the pre-existing solutions, and it can compound some other solutions. For example, I have seen very pleasant code bases that use Remix and Effect. I've seen some prototypes of Effect together with React Server components, and it also plays fairly well. So both, what you said, both compounds and replace.
So a question about that. As you said, one of the primary motivations for ditching the JVM in favor of Node was the fact that you could leverage the knowledge and capabilities of your existing front-end developers, that they could transition easily from being front-end to being full stack and do the BFF stuff. And my question is, if I take a TypeScript developer that's familiar, let's say, with TypeScript, obviously, but also, let's say, with React or something like that, or maybe Svelte, and I bring them on board to a project that uses Effect, what's the onboarding challenge like? I mean, when they look at the code, will they recognize that code as being TypeScript, or will it be, too different, so that in effect it's like I might as well have been using the JVM because it's going to be Greek to them?
That's a great question. Surprisingly, JavaScript people have a brain which is already wired in thinking in terms of components. I believe that's thanks to the developments in React, where React is really widely used. Why? Because it simplified UI development and allowed you to think in terms of composable UI components. When you think about effect, you think in terms of composable backend components or composable business logic components. So the brain doesn't have to do a huge switch. And the second element that makes the adoption path easier is that JavaScript has a sync await. Like you mentioned that before, we were living in an era where a sync await did not exist, promises did not exist for I mean, I was writing callbacks, and they're not really nice, and you get this meme of callback hell or promise hell and so on and so forth. Async await makes that easy. Why? It brings back imperativeness to an otherwise declarative model, which is promise.then or CPS, continuation passing style, which is got renamed to callbacks in JavaScript land, but the original name is really continuation passing style because you pass down a way of continuing your program. Async await makes that easy. Now you might ask, is async await available for effect? I would say no. So why have you even said async await in the first place if you can't use async await? Well, there's another feature in JavaScript which is lesser known than async await, which are generators. So you can mentally swap async with function star and await with yield star, and your whole mental model works. You can use effect in the same way as you use async await, just by using generators. So if a newcomer reads the code, they're going to be able to understand it. They might not be able to jump in and write it, but just as if they are experiencing React, they'll probably not be able to adopt Vue in half an hour. Might take them slightly more than half an hour to say, oh, okay, this library works in this specific way, and so on and so forth. But they grasp the concept. They can read the library code from the very beginning. I'm not a front-end developer, but I've seen code bases that use React, code bases that use Vue, code bases that use Angular. I can read the code. I can reason about the code without knowing the details of it. Pretty much the same experience you get with effect. And then takes, I would say, a few hours to be able to use effect productively, and probably a few decades to learn the whole thing. And you don't have to. Again, it's like wanting to learn JavaScript by having to learn every single module on NPM. Might be a bit too much, but the learning curve is very, very progressive, and it is very linear. The only non-linear part is the first few hours. The first few hours, you're gonna be in a shock, and you're gonna hate yourself for the decisions you've taken. But then that stops. That stops very quickly, and what I've seen is a trend where people that start use effect, that was a pun on React here, no dad jokes. People that started doing the effect thing, there we go, usually don't come back. I've never seen anyone removing effect from the code base. That's a very interesting element because there's a lot of, I've never seen a stable code in general. People swap libraries constantly, they rewrite, and so on and so forth. If they started integrating effect is there and most likely took over their whole application, and that person or that team will tell you that they can no longer write plain JavaScript or plain TypeScript without effect. It's the same thing when you learn TypeScript. You can't anymore write JavaScript. I wrote JavaScript for ages. I would prefer to change job than write JavaScript without TypeScript again. Like if you tomorrow tell me you have to pick, Mike, if you want to stay employed, you have to write JavaScript. I would probably become, I don't know, a pizza maker or a different profession. I would not
Funnily,
like to do that.
funnily enough, at SciSense, there's this piece of core legacy code that's unfortunately very much still in JavaScript, and people are wary of touching it.
It scares you to touch it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't know if you're changing something. You don't know if you're breaking anything else. TypeScript is a very good step forward in the direction of giving you confidence in maintaining the code base. If that code base was effect, you could quite literally refactor thousands and thousands of lines of code and be sure that if it compiles, it works.
Yeah. One of the challenges, though, with TypeScript, and I think both Theo and the Primogens have spoken about it, is that there are like two levels of using TypeScript. There's like the app developer level, and there's the library level. Like you don't need to dive too deep into TypeScript and generic types and stuff like that in most cases if you're just working at the application level. But if you really want to make library code as type safe as possible, then it can become a challenge. And I'm sure that you have spent a lot of hours with Effect thinking about what would be the best type signature for particular APIs. And so my question in this context is, where does Effect fall in that spectrum? Like, is it is how challenging is the typing when I'm writing code in Effect, especially given that it's kind of like type safety ensure correctness, so kind of like as you said, kind of like you would get in languages like Elm.
Well, that is again a great question and a great point, which is arguable. I think I agree more with the sentiment that Matt Pocock has brought out, which is yes, both the two different TypeScript exist, library level and up level, but in up level you have that lib directory where you have the mix and match, where you do have to write a little bit of library level code in the app. Effect, the usage of effect surprisingly requires almost no manual typing. Like when you write a function using async await, you don't have to annotate the promise return type manually. The same thing is with effect, with the difference that you're going to get inference for the errors and inference for the dependencies.
Oh, very cool. So basically, you've done most of the heavy lifting, and when I use Effect, I just get most of the benefits out just by straightforward inference.
I think I wrote thousands of lines of effect code in examples and so on and so forth without ever specifying a type manually. Of course, sometimes you might want to specify a type manually, but the point is you don't have to, which is to me how it should be. Even with promises, you can annotate a return type if you want to be sure that this is the actual return type. And sometimes you have to do that for performance reasons, like especially if you have functions that are reused in a lot of places in your code. If you use inference on those functions, then the LSP is going to have performance issues. But this has nothing to do with effect. This is very, very general TypeScript points. The same applies with effect. So sometimes you have to write types, or well, sometimes you want to write types, but usually you don't. Usually you don't have to. And to me, this sort of goes back to the point of having the compiler as a friend that tells you what's going on versus the compiler as a math teacher that grades your correctness. I feel more in the space of the compiler as a friend that helps you discover what your program is doing. When I write effect code, I then look at the type signature, which is completely inferred, and I realize from that, this is what I've done. This is the error cases that my program may issue when may encounter when it's executed. And then if I handle one of those, the type system will tell me that that error is no longer present, all by inference, not by me specifying the types. So by no means it's a type heavy element. We have also, I've mentioned briefly before, schema, effect schema, which is a similar approach to Zod, IOTS, and so on and so forth. That's really where a user starts with defining the types in their system. Those are more domain level types. You're modeling your user base. If you are doing a to-do MVC, you're going to have a to-do type. Those are the types, the concrete types that you use. There's almost never a generic in those, as you pointed out, rightfully so. And a very effect-based code base would use schema to define the data model of their application and would infer the hell out of everything else in the way I would use it. Of course, there are users who write explicit types for everything. I don't agree with that. That way of programming.
I dislike it. I've seen ESLint configured or TS-ESLint configured to require that, and I dislike it. I prefer as much type inference as possible. Whenever I need to explicitly specify the type of a return type of a function, it almost feels like a failure.
Yes, and we've done a lot of work so that you don't have to.
All right. Well, I'm wondering if there's more to get into before we do picks, because we're kind of getting to that amount of time. I guess my question is, Michael, because you've talked about moving off the JVM to something like effect, or the other one is just if I started a new project today, what are the best ways to kind of roll into this and make it work how I want?
Well, we have our website, which is incredibly easy to remember because the website of Effect is called effect.website. And we have an amazing Discord community, which is by now more than 3,000 people. And those are not just numbers. They constantly write and help each other. And the teammates also help newcomers. So definitely join Discord and definitely try out Effect. If there is another question that I would like to address, it came from tweets and other podcasts, and I think we had a small exchange with Dan at some point in time, and it is about the company behind Effect. There is a company now which is called Effectful Technologies, and we've raised VC money last year, and some people were surprised, and they even said that, monetizing something like Effect is crazy. I agree. Monetizing something like Effect is absolutely crazy. That's not the plan. The plan is to develop services and bring composability to higher levels of infrastructure where it's not going to be Effect anymore. They're really going to be plain and simple commercial services. Effect is open source, will always remain open source. The Effect organization is not even owned by the company. it's owned by the contributors. It hasn't shifted in ownership when we funded the company. This was a question I intended to answer on a podcast, but I was like, other people got that question asked, and I was like, maybe I should answer that specific question, given I'm probably the only one who knows the plan. But really, be sure if you use Effect, it's an open source library, it's community first, and it has survived 5 years without a company behind and without VC money behind. So even if the company burns, which is highly probable given that VC-backed companies are high risk, high reward, most of them fails. So realistically, we will also fail. I hope not, of course, but that's the default outcome. Effect will stay alive, will be preserved the way it was preserved before, without any trouble or change of license or any of the weirdness of mixing open source with commercial activities. Right. That was one other point I wanted to cover.
Well, that's good to hear. It reminds me a little bit of like Next.js and Vercel, right?
Where, very similar.
It's Next.js, completely open source, community run, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, a lot of the people work for Vercel that work on it. But at the end of the day, when you want to deploy your Next.js app, Vercel is your happy place kind of thing, right? They specifically go after the things that you're going to want.
It seems to have become a fairly popular model of having an open source project and alongside it a commercial company. So obviously Vercel is kind of like the poster child, but also the Astro project is doing something similar. And even Million.js is a new upstart project, or I think are Y Combinator funded, and there are others as well. So it will be interesting to see if this model, how successful this model of an open source project, which is by definition open source and will remain open source regardless of anything else, but that alongside to it, there's a company that's kind of supporting that project and looking to make revenue in some sort of a way in adjacent to that project. So it will be interesting to see how successful this model is over time.
I think that discussing that would definitely require probably a different episode or a very long type of conversation. I'm not sure the model is going to be successful at all. If anything, I don't believe in that model in general. You might say, but you've done the same. Yes. I believe Vercel with Next.js is a very peculiar example of a model that can work, because Vercel is the best place to deploy any front end, not only if you use Next.
Right.
That's the key differentiation. And I'm gonna stop here, otherwise I'm revealing too much of the road where we are pointing. But it's I appreciate Vercel a lot as a company, and I take a lot of inspiration from it.
So I just have one more quick question. You mentioned that you have a website that's effect.website, and we mentioned that there was a conference, and you can find the talks, I think, on YouTube.
Yes.
Do you also have a Discord channel where people can ask questions, stuff like that?
We absolutely have a Discord community. It's an amazing place where people help each other. There's almost 3,000. There's actually more than 3,000 users on it that are constantly writing themselves, helping themselves, and so on and so forth. All of our development happens on Discord. So that is the central place where I spend most of my day. So also, if you want to chat with me, either Twitter or the new name X. I always feel strange calling it X. Hope Elon is not listening to us. There's a small chance. If he does, please call it Twitter again.
I actually hope, well, we should all hope that he does, because if he tweets it then, or X's it, or whatever it's called these days, posts it, then the
I,
podcast
I hope
and effect will explode.
I
I
was
hope
gonna
that's the
say
case.
I'm totally fine with Elon actually coming out and going, these guys are idiots, right? Because we would still get that same effect. So, pun
Same
not
effect.
intended. I wasn't thinking about it. Anyway, let's go ahead and do our picks and then start wrapping up. Let's start with AJ. AJ, what are your picks?
Now that I've unmuted myself, well, I became a motorcyclist. I have a motorcycle now, and I would recommend to anybody the MSF Basic Rider course. If anybody's in the United States, at least, if you're interested in becoming one of the organ donors, then the best way to prevent actually having to donate your organs would be to take that course. It already saved my bacon when a semi cut in front of me, and since I'd already low-sided the bike during the practice course and was already familiar with why not to panic by grabbing the front brake, I panicked instead by swerving, straightening the bike, and then applying the brake. And that got me safely onto the shoulder of the road rather than under the semi. So it's good.
AJ, do you know what the other word for motorcycles is that traffic cops use? Along the lines of what you were just saying?
No.
Donor cycle.
Donor cycle. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, what was the other thing I was going to mention? There was something else I think related to that. Give me just a second. My brain's a little slower today because of the cold. Oh, one of the pieces of protection that people often don't think about, or at least it wasn't one of the things I first thought about. I knew to get the helmet and the pants and the jacket and the gloves, but the hearing protection. There's a brand of hearing protection called Alpine MotoSafe, and the biggest problem is not the muffler or the engine noise. The biggest problem is the wind noise. And these earplugs are designed in such a way that's kind of interesting. They have a little stem that comes out of them. And much like you've got that little hair in your ear that transmits the sound, the stem actually helps transmit sound that is in the vocal range and I guess other ranges that you need to hear. So when you put the earplugs in and someone's speaking to you, it still sounds weird when you're speaking to someone else, but when someone's speaking to you, you can actually hear pretty darn well. And they're very effective at blocking out the wind noise. So although they have a lower dB rating, like a lot of the cheapo foam ones are rated at something like 33 dB, and these are only rated at 20. But part of that, I think, is because of they're very effective at reducing wind noise, but they're not effective at reducing all noise because they're designed to actually let some sound pass through. So I think that they are adequate protection. They're very comfortable to wear. So anyway, yeah, if you want to have really, really long discussions with your wife over a period of weeks or months, or possibly even years, get into motorcycling. It's a sense of freedom that is amazing. Absolutely amazing. That's my picks for the day.
Awesome. Dan, what are your picks?
I don't have a whole lot in terms of picks for today. I do have one. So obviously there's the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, both in Gaza and between Israel and Lebanon. And I know that it has made a lot of people like interested in or have opinions on like the origins of this conflict and who's at fault and how things came to be and stuff like that. I want to highlight a documentary that came out a long time ago, like in the 80s, as I recall. It's called Pillar of Fire. It's an Israeli documentary, so Obviously, it represents the Israeli view on things, but they did try very hard to also to be, first of all, fact-based, and also present a lot of the Palestinian side or the Arab side as well. It's talks about the origins of Zionism going back to the 1850s and all the way to the founding of the State of Israel, and covering all that period in between. We're talking about a period of over 100 years. And it like I said, it's from the 80s. So on the one hand, it's you might say that it's a bit dated, but it also means that a lot of people that were involved in that process were still alive back then to be interviewed. And that documentary includes a lot of such interviews and a lot of the amazing original footage that was shot like more or less when they invented cameras. And it's a great documentary series. You can find episodes of it in English on YouTube. I'll link to some of the episodes that are actually available on YouTube. So if this topic is interesting to you, I highly recommend this series. And that's my pick for today. By the way, do you know where the phrase "pillar of fire" comes from?
Oh, heck yeah, I know it.
Yeah,
So you can also understand why it's been used in this context. Like yeah.
Yep. All right. That's something that I'm interested in, so I'll have to go check those out. Steve, what are your picks?
Before my pre-planned one, I have a couple picks that came up inspired by our initial conversations here. One comes from one of my favorite sources of puns and jokes. It's called the Pun Bible. It's pretty short. It says it's a conversation between a student and teacher, and it says, "Student, 32 degrees Fahrenheit is equal to 0 degrees Celsius, right?" Teacher says, "Yes." In other words, so I said, "So in other words, 0 degrees Celsius plus 0 degrees Celsius equals 64 degrees Fahrenheit." Thank you. Now, in honor of AJ and the absolute torture that he's been going through with his cold over the past week, one of my favorite sources of humor is the Babylon Bee. Oh, they're so good.
So good.
Oh, I love the Bee. And anyway, one series of posts that they're always doing over the year is about how men will suffer from a cold, and as compared to the women. And this particular post that I looked up was from last year, and it says, it's titled, "This is the worst pain any human has ever felt. Man with flu tells wife who has pushed 3 children out of body." And so it starts out, I'll give the first couple paragraphs. "Local man AJ O'Neill became bedridden Tuesday after a flu virus brutally assaulted his body with a sore throat, coughing, some body aches, and even a mild fever. This is the worst pain any human has ever felt," he told his wife, Sally, who previously pushed 3 whole children out of her body. The comment reportedly led to a brief spat in which the suffering man edged precariously towards death's door. Anyway, it goes on from there. So I'll put the link in the notes, hopefully, but it's classic Babylon Bee.
My wife's name is not Sally, by the way.
By the way, it kind of reminds me of this thing that says that if you are a man and you want to experience, like how childbirth feels like, then what you should do is, first of all, grab your lower lip.
Yes, Carol Burnett.
And then pull it over your head.
Yes. Back before Bill Cosby went nuts, he has a classic routine called Himself. That was an HBO special from '85. And there's a section in there where he's talking about his wife giving birth to childbirth. Hysterical. And he, in that sketch, he brings up that quote. And then when he's talking about his wife giving birth, he talks about how she stood up in the stirrups and grabbed his lower lip and started to pull up over his head. So that's a great one. And finally, the dad jokes of the week. So one day I changed the light bulb, I crossed the road, and I walked into a bar, and that's when I realized my whole life was a joke. Yeah. Question: what dating app do cannibals use? It's called Tender. Right. So the other day, speaking of biblical references, I found $30 in the parking lot, and I thought to myself, what would Jesus do? So I turned it into wine.
That's a good one.
Those are my picks for the week.
All right. I'll jump in with a few picks. I usually do a board game or a card game. To be honest, I've kind of been heads down on a bunch of other stuff. So let me just think for a second on which one I want to pick. I'm going to go a little bit different direction. So my 18-year-old really likes retro games, video games, especially video game consoles. So he actually walked like 6 or 7 miles down to the retro game store in American Fork and bought himself a Wii. And so we've been playing Wii Sports around here lately. And
yes, Wii Sports Resort. Wii Sports is sort of boring. Wii Sports Resort is a little better.
I don't think I've done the Wii Sports Resort, but I will tell you that it's been fun, doing the bowling and baseball. And anyway, so I'm going to pick that. I'm going to pick a video game instead of a board game today. A few other things that I'm going to throw out. So one of them is, and this is going way off the tech train or toys train, but about a year or so ago, it's been more than that. It's been a few years. I started having issues where if I would eat wheat products of any kind, I'd get sick. And so I was talking to my new stepdad. My mom got remarried a couple months ago. And he was like, well, have you tried, he told me to try 2 different things. I haven't tried one of them. I haven't tried ancient grains, but he's like, have you tried sourdough? And I was like, no. And so I kept meaning to try it, but I didn't know anything about it. And then I was chatting with a friend of mine, and she brought up that she bakes a loaf of bread every few days, and it's sourdough. She has a sourdough starter that lives in her fridge. And so she gave me some of that, and I've been doing sourdough ever since. And I'll tell you what, it's made a huge difference, because I used to have just kind of lingering stomach pain over days, just because I would get whatever wheat product, and anyway, since I started eating the sourdough about a month ago, that pain's gone away and I haven't had any issues. And it's also nice because I have real bread to make like sandwiches and stuff with. So I'm going to pick sourdough. Now, a couple of things I'm going to put out there. So we already had a KitchenAid mixer. And there's a website this lady does. She talks all about sourdough. So I'll put links to her Instagram, because she's got a series of Instagram stories that you can watch to kind of walk you through the whole process. And she's also got a website where she makes that work. And I've got my Apple Assistant on my computer trying to pick up on what I'm saying, which is very annoying. Anyway, so I'm going to shout that out. One of the things that you need is also it's a Dutch oven. And I don't know if outside the U.S. you really have Dutch ovens. It's a cast iron pot. And the ones that you want to cook stuff in your oven they're enameled, right? So they've got the polish on them, right? They don't look like cast iron pots. You pick them up, they feel like cast iron pots. But anyway, so I've been baking my own bread for the last month, and it's amazing. So I'm trying to find the website where all this stuff is at. Oh, here we go. And she's been super helpful too, as far as like just figuring out, okay, this didn't turn out the way I wanted. So anyway, I'll put these links in here, but it's such good bread. And even when it doesn't come out looking just like this lady's bread, it was still so good. Anyway, so I'm dropping it in the comments. It's kind of a long Instagram deal, but that's her stories on how to make the sourdough. And then I'll put this at simplesourdoughbread.com, and that's where I get the other stuff. So yeah, so I'm picking bread and stuff like that. And then one last thing that I'm going to pick, and this is just I'm just getting into this now. Most of this is focused on Ruby on Rails, which is what I spend most of my time writing code in. There's a book called the Rails and Stimulus Codex, and it basically walks you through writing an application in Ruby on Rails with a Stimulus front end and with Turbo Native, so that you can get quasi hybrid native apps out of your Ruby on Rails applications. And you can do it for other applications too, right? Because it basically just wraps around a web application, and then it uses Strata to give you which is the Italian word for road, but it gives you that pathway to get native elements into your Turbo Native app. And then Turbo Native just gives you the wrapper around your web application, so you can have the mobile app. And yeah, so far I've got the Turbo Native stuff. I'm just getting into Strata now, and then we'll be getting into the rest of the stuff with Stimulus and Turbo. Turbo's kind of like HTMX, but anyway, I'm really, really digging it. So I'm going to pick the Rails and Hotwire Codex by Ayush Nuatia and Turbo Native.
You should probably come on this podcast called JavaScript Jabber to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I should. Maybe I'll get Ayush to come on. He's one of our new panelists on Ruby Rogues. But yeah. And he's a former native developer in Swift and Kotlin. So anyway, that's what I've been playing with lately. Michael, what are your picks?
Oh, so I'm mixed, but I have to double down what AJ said at the beginning. I am a biker and definitely do safety driving courses, because your instincts play in a weird way when you get scared, and you gotta train them very well. I was lucky enough to get my first bike when I was 6 years old, so I kind of have second nature instincts by now, but it's definitely not normal. And especially if you get into biking at a later age, do a safety course, protections and everything else. What AJ said, it's good. I didn't know about the year thing. I'll try them out. Please send me a link, maybe offline. I'm curious. And so I have to double down what AJ said, and in a relatively similar fashion, but a completely different thing. I recently got into go-karting.
Fun.
Do start do go-karting. I purchased a KZ kart, which is a shifter kart with 6 gears, and it's killing me. I go there on the weekend. I feel like I'm the best driver in the world. I'm of course the slowest on the track. And the Monday like today, I'm in pain in my whole body due to the physical exercise. But it's a very good way to get out of your comfort zone, out in the open, and have fun. So my pick is go-karting.
How fast do these go-karts go?
Well, that depends. Do you want to know in American terms or European terms? I can tell you in European terms. Last time I clocked like 137 kilometers per hour on the track.
Yeah, see, in America, go-kart means a children's toy or perhaps family recreational.
It's not.
That's not necessarily true.
I was going to say.
I go karting at a place out here on the west side of Portland, and the karts that you can just go rent and drive around their track are get up to like 60 miles an hour. And there's some serious kart. There's races. There's people with their own karts, and they can go really fast.
I have never heard of a go-kart that goes more than like 20 miles an hour.
Oh no, the karting.
I have some neighbors that have some that. Oh yeah, they whip around the neighborhood faster than the cars go.
No, these are on the track. This isn't just around the neighborhood.
Yeah. 137 kilometers per hour is about 85 miles per hour. So that sucker is moving.
Yeah, that's pretty good speed.
It is moving. It has 6 gears, so
Yeah.
like it's serious horsepower.
Yeah, that's fast enough
Always.
to take on the freeway here in the U.S.
Yeah.
and get a speeding ticket.
Yeah.
Yes, you can get speeding tickets.
Not in Utah, but in other places.
And
Oh
by
no,
the way,
the freeway
that's,
here is
that's
70
on-
miles an hour, 75 miles an hour.
That's with
You
with
get out of
short-
town, it's 80.
Yeah.
because the track is not long. If you
Right.
put long shifts, it goes up to 200 easily. It's the closest thing to a Formula One you can drive.
Wow.
If you search on
That or a Tesla.
I can't wait to tell my wife. She's going to be so excited to hear about this.
Yeah,
My
typically
wife owns the tax because it costs a lot of money overall, but it's very fun.
Yeah, the go-karts that I've seen here, they're typically not road legal.
Right.
I mean, if you're in your neighborhood or you're not on the main road, right? I don't go out to the highway or whatever. Nobody cares. But yeah, I've seen some pretty serious stuff. And then you get the off-road vehicles that you go down to. There are some sand dunes south of the lake here that people go out and do that. Or we also don't live terribly far from the Bonneville salt flats, where you could probably go do some.
Yeah,
fun
you
stuff.
could go really fast there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just don't forget to wear a helmet.
Yeah.
Don't forget to wear a helmet. That's the only thing you wear on a go-kart. You don't have safety, anything else. You just have a helmet, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
And it's
That
got
sounds
roll
so
bars,
fun.
right? So you just strap in, and the roll bars are your safety net.
Well, you don't have roll bars.
Yeah.
So
You're
you
out
just
in the open. If you
you
crash,
just don't wreck it. You just don't wreck it. That's your safety.
Yeah, just don't crash.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
When I first asked about how to drive a go-kart proficiently on a track, the track manager, who used to be number 4 in the world championship in the maximum category of karting, looked at me and was like, "Mike, the green, just don't go there. The weed,
Yeah.
just stay on track." That was his advice.
Don't go in the grass.
Don't go in the grass. Yes, that's the advice on how to drive a go-kart.
I really want to go now.
Yes,
Maybe
another
I'm
reason
crazy.
to come to-
Yeah. Go karting in Siena. That I'm so in. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks for coming, Michael. If people want to connect with you online, we've already said effect.website, but I'm guessing you're on Twitter and things like that. Where do people find you?
Twitter or Discord. Discord
Okay.
is better. I usually spend more time on Discord than Twitter, because then I start reading tweets, I get angry, I close down my laptop, and so on and so forth, and the whole cycle restarts. But I'm more on Discord, but also Twitter is very fine. The only trouble, I guess, with contacting me on Twitter is recently I've got like people seems like they can't send me, or when they send me a DM, it gets hidden, so I might not reply. I have no idea why. Again, Elon Musk, if he's listening to this, should probably fix that. But Discord doesn't have that problem. So
Yeah, I have open DMs, and if I haven't approved you or I'm not following you, then they won't show up. And so then, periodically it's like, oh, you messaged me a month or 2 or 3 months ago. Yeah. Anyway,
I didn't know 2 months ago. Sorry.
Yeah. What's your Twitter handle?
Michael Arnaldi.
Oh, easy to remember. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Until next time, folks. Max out.
Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for having me.
All right, hang on for a second.